last 5 years was moving to India. It was time for a change. Michael was a single man who had no ties to the city. His mother and father had moved to Arizona 2 years ago to retire. His sister was now married and living with her husband in Vermont. It was time for him to move. While at college he had become best friends with Steve Janik. He was always asking him to come and stay with him in LA. He worked at a computer firm and could get Mike a job right away. Since Mike had just lost his job at the computer firm where he had been working, he decided to take his friend up on the offer. So it was with lots of hopes and dreams that Mike Platt left the windy city known as Chicago and headed towards LA. It was a long ride alone and he wanted to stop and see his folks along the way. Fortunately, he had just bought a new car this past year. He would not have to worry about travel and his severance pay had been enough to support him for a few months, or until he was able to get settled down in the new city. Mike started out that morning and headed southward toward Arizona. The heat was unbearable when he reached the Arizona desert, and was glad that he had chosen to have air conditioning in his car. When he had purchased it he had thought that the air conditioning would be a waste of money while he was living in the windy city. But now LA and Arizona would have been unbearable without it. He looked at the sand and the cactus that dotted the scenery and thought of his hometown and how different the land was. He found it hard to believe that his mother and father were happy here after being born and living in the city. But they had written him and told him of the good times that they both were enjoying here in this new world. As Mike pulled his car into their driveway, both his mother and father came out to greet him. They were both in their late 50s and the Arizona sun had done them both good. They both had dark tans and looked as if they had been working out. Mike was surprised to learn that they had taken up playing tennis. The visit with his parents had been too short, but he promised that now he was going to be living in LA he would come to see them more often. John and Marie Platt smiled and waved to him as he left for his friend's home and his new life. As Mike approached the city he looked up and saw all the fog and the buildings. Life was what was happening in the big city and he was going to make it big. He had high hopes for a good life here in California. Mike pulled his car into the driveway of his friend and new roommate Steve Janik. The house that he had rented was on a quiet street near the heart of the bustling city. As Mike went to get out of his car, his friend Steve came out to greet him. Steve was a good-looking man with a deep tan black hair and dark eyes. He stood about 6 feet tall and has glistening white teeth. The two shook hands and went on into the home. The home was what would be called a bungalow and everything was on one floor. Steve showed Mike his room. The room was a large room with a bath right next to it. He looked around the room and was pleased at what he saw. The house had a large living room with a bay window and a built-in bookcase in the corner. It had a large eat-in kitchen and a full walk-in basement that had been done over. It had a large backyard with a patio to enjoy the hot summer nights on. I have spoken to my boss and he is very interested in offering you a job. He will see you on Monday at 10 if that is all right with you. It is a small company where I work and all of us work very closely together. We run programs and make programs for all different types of business in LA and all around the world. I think you will find the job both challenging and interesting. The pay is good also. The jobs start at $40,000 a year for the type of work that you will be doing. Steve told him. Mike thought about it. The pay was a little less than what he had been getting at his other job, but of course now he would be the bottom man in the company. Thank you for the offer. I will be glad to meet your boss on Monday. Mike told him with a smile. That evening Mike spent the time unpacking. He had only brought what was needed, all. His belongings had to fit into his car. He was nearly done by the time he went to bed, thanks to his friend's help. The two had worked well together, and he hoped that their friendship would last through the turmoil of two single men sharing a small house. The next day was Sunday, and once again Mike spent most of the morning getting his room in order. He stepped into the hallway and could smell something cooking. He remembered that Steve had been a good cook, so he walked into the kitchen. "The food smells good. What do you have cooking?" he asked. "I have made for us a couple of steaks with petite potatoes and carrots. It will be done in about an hour." "I thought that the smell of the food might bring you out of your room," Steve told him with a smile. The dinner was delicious and the two men ate every bite. Steve was going to go out into the yard and do some work. It was then that Mike thought it would be a good idea for him to go out with him and give him a hand. The house was now his responsibility now, and yard work could be hard and tiring. The garden that his friend was working on was large and had many vegetables: tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers and cabbage. The warm weather of the city made the plants grow large and tall, but it also made the weeds grow also. So it took the two men nearly 2 hours before they had finished. The rest of the day was spent out on the patio. They had a couple of beers and talked of the good old college years. The day had been a good day and Mike wanted to go to bed early. After all, he was to meet Steve's boss in the morning. Mike was glad that he left early that morning. Although the office where Steve worked was just 5 miles away, the traffic made the ride slow. The freeways were so confusing, with some exits that go down the center, some go on the left, and then the ones that go off of the right-hand side of the road. The office was on the 6th floor. It did take the whole floor, and the rooms were crowded with the desks and the people. Mike walked in the door and was greeted by the woman that he was going to make his wife. He knew it. If she was not married, Mike was going to make the girl his. The young woman introduced herself as Laurie Street. She took him right to Mr. Bowers' office, where he would interview him. Ryan Bowers was a young man not much older than he was. He was about 5'10" and 150 pounds. He shook hands with Mike and they both took a seat. The interview went well and he was offered a job. He could start the job the next morning. Laurie Street had almost fallen over when she had seen the new man who would be working with her. He looked to be around her age, and oh, what a looker. He was over 6 feet tall and slender with sandy blonde hair. He had such a nice voice. Oh, she wanted to get to know him. And she could not wait for him to start working with her. That evening Laurie came home to find her sister Della cooking them something to eat. It was not often that her sister was home before her. Della worked for a very famous attorney by the name of Perry Mason, and she was always busy working on different murder cases that he would usually solve with her. Laura's sister's relationship with her boss was up in the air. Laurie was never sure about them, so she tried not to talk to her sister about it. But, for the first time ever, she was attracted to a man that she had barely said 2 words to that day. Laurie was sure that Della would think her childish, but she had to tell her. She could barely contain her excitement. "Good evening, young lady. Dinner will be done in about 10 minutes. Go ahead and get washed up. I will handle everything here," Della told her sister with a sweet smile. Laurie took a seat at the table and took her plate. Della took a look at her younger sister and saw that she was just about jumping out of her seat with some sort of news. So Della asked her, "How was your day?" "Della, please do not laugh at me. I met a man named Mike Platt today and I think that I could fall in love with him." The minute our eyes met, my heart melted. Oh, there have been some men in my life, but this is the first time that I ever felt this way about any man. Della took a look at her sister. It was true, the men that had come courting her had nearly worn the carpet down, but Lori had never acted like this about a man that she had only met for a few moments. So she said to her sister, "Well, are you going to see him again? He is going to be working at my office starting tomorrow. He has just moved here from Chicago, where his company has just relocated to India. He is a roommate of one of my co-workers. You know Steve Janik? Well, it turns out that the two of them went to college together," Lori told her with a smile. "He is so cute. OMG. Well, I hope that the two of you do get to know each other better, and I wish you all the best," Della told her with a smile. "So how was your day? I was surprised to find you home today. Usually you work late." "It is a pleasure to have some time with me," Lori told her. "Perry has gone off with his brother Dave for the evening. It is not often that they get the time together either. So, for once the office closed at 5 and I am," Della told her sister with a smile. That morning Lori got up early. She tried on 4 different outfits before she settled with her navy blue pantsuit. She had thought about wearing a dress, but at her office a dress was not a good choice for clothing. There were many times when she had found herself working on different wiring. When this happened, Lori could find herself working on the floor. Lori and Della headed out the door that morning to their jobs at around 7 am. It was a beautiful day and the sun was already shining bright. The temperature was in the middle 80s. It was a good day for romance. As Lori punched the button to take her to the 6th floor, she saw Mike coming into the lobby, so she held the elevator door open for him. "Good morning, Mike. Are you ready for your first day on the job?" Lori said in a sweet voice. "OMG, what an idiot I sound like a child," she thought to herself. She did not want him to know that her heart was beating nearly twice as fast as normal, and she was sweating of all things. Mike smiled at Lori and said, "Good morning. I am ready for my first day. But now that I have seen you, my day has brightened up." They were so busy talking to each other they almost let the door shut on Steve. They both blushed and watched eagerly for the floors to change. Steve looked at his two friends, my oh my, Lori the prettiest little thing in the office, and his roommate. Well, you never know. When the door opened to the 6th floor, all 3 of them got off. The 3 of them went over to their desks and Mike took a look at the pile of work that was already piled up on his desk. It was going to be a busy pace to work. But with his new friend Lori and his roommate Steve, the first day went smoothly for him. Della came into the office and began to make the morning coffee when her friend and boss, Perry Mason, came in. She followed him into the main office and handed him a cup of coffee. "Good morning, Perry. How was your night with Dave?" "Good morning, Della. As always, the time that I get to spend with my brother is too rare. And too short. But we had a good time. He is leaving early this morning for his home, and once again we won't be seeing each other for a few weeks," Perry told her as he took a seat at his big oak desk. "I might have time to fix my hair," she told him with a laugh. He bent over and kissed her softly on the lips. And the two of them headed home. Lori spent the day at work watching the new man named Mike. He was a very skilled computer programmer. He sat right across from her and she had caught him glancing at her a couple of times. She had always been friends with Steve, but had not done things socially with him often. She knew that Mike had to be about her age as he had gone to college with Steve was just a year older than she was. As the office closed that night, Lori, Mike and Steve left together. They walked out to their cars and said their good nights. Mike had thought about asking Lori out, but he would get to know her a little better. She was smart and very knowledgeable. Each day that week Lori and Mike talked and got to know each other better. On Thursday, Lori had gone over to one of the fax machines when Mike had walked over at the same time. He smiled down at her and asked her out for dinner Friday night. Lori nearly fell over when he had asked her. They would try out a nightclub of her choice. He was new in town and thought that she might have a good idea where to go. Lori was on cloud nine when she got home that evening. Her sister Della was already home and having a lemonade out on the patio. Lori smiled down at her and said, "Guess who has a date for tomorrow night?" "Why, how did you guess that Perry asked me out?" Della smiled. She knew that Lori was trying to tell her that she had a date. "That is great. Where are you going?" Lori asked her. "Oh, I do not know, but dinner and a dance. With Perry it can be any place." "Well, Mike asked me out today. I get to choose where we are going to go. He says that because he is new in town I probably know the best places to go." "That is good news. Do you have any idea where you are going to take him?" Della asked her sister. "I was thinking about going to the nightclub that we went to the last time. That I went with you and my friends. Do you remember that? We ended up with Perry and his brother Dave. It was a real great place." Lori told her. "That place was loud and so crowded." "What about the Kavanaugh? The food is great and the dancing is your type." "It is fast and I heard that they have some of the most popular bands playing there all the time." Della offered her. "That is a good place. We would have a chance to talk there. At the other nightclub all we will be able to do is shout to each other." "I will have to think about it. What is going on with you 2 days this week? You have been home at a normal hour?" Lori asked her. Della smiled at her and said, "I do not know. I guess that it has not been my lucky week." Friday was another day for Perry Mason and his trusted associate. The case was going well for Perry, and that afternoon the judge ruled in his client's favor. Everyone shook hands. And at 3:45 Perry told Della that she could leave for her home. "Get ready, young lady, because we are going to have a night on the town." He took both hands into his and smiled to her. "I will pick you up at 6:30. We have reservations at the Kavanaugh at 7. Della got home and started humming to herself. She put her hair up and got ready for her big date. She chose out the outfit and shoes. She wanted to wear shoes that were made for a formal date, yet you could still dance in them. Lori came home just after 5 and was surprised to see Della's car in the driveway. "Della, are you home?" she called. Della came into the living room. "Hi Lori, I am getting ready for my date, remember," she told her with a grin. There was a knock on the door just a few minutes later and Della answered the door. It was the florist, and he had 2 different flower arrangements for the home. There were 2 cards. One addressed to Della and the other to Lori. Della looked at the cards and called out to Lori. "Look what just came. Mike and Perry have sent us these." She handed Lori her flowers. Mike had sent her a lovely basket with daisy and different flowers. Perry had sent Della a dozen red roses. Each of the women would put their flowers in their room. Della smiled. Perry never forgot how much she loved roses. Lori was honored. Mike must be a real gentleman. Della was always getting flowers, but she had only gotten flowers from one other man. The flowers were beautiful and she put them on her nightstand. She could not wait for Mike to come. Lori hoped that he would come before Perry came to pick up Della. She would like her sister to meet him. Perhaps Perry could meet him too. Laurie liked Perry and respected him. Mike was supposed to pick up Laurie at around 6:30, and that was the same time that Perry was supposed to be picking up Della. Perry had been glad that he had time to order the flowers. He had to sneak off and call from his cell phone that day during the lunch hour. Sometimes working with the person that you truly cared for made it hard to surprise them. He had thought about buying her 5 dozen roses as he had done before, but he wanted to save that many roses for very special times. As he pulled up to Della's house, he was surprised to see a young man going up her walkway. He was a young man, and Perry thought to himself that he must be coming to see Laurie. Perry started up the walkway and the young man turned around to look because he had heard the footsteps behind him. "Hello, my name is Mike Platt, are you friends of Laurie?" he offered his hand, and the two men shook hands. "Pleased to meet you, my name is Perry Mason and Laurie is indeed a friend of mine," he told the young man with a smile. The man surprised him. Of course he had heard of the famous lawyer, and then it dawned on him. When he had been introduced to Laurie, he had thought that he had heard her last name before. Della Street was the name of the secretary of the famous Perry Mason. Was this her house too, he wondered. Perry reached over and rang the doorbell. The door opened and Laurie was standing there. "Come in, Perry and Mike." "Welcome. Have you been introduced?" Laurie asked them. "Yes, we met here at the door actually," Mike offered with a smile. It was then that Della came in the room. She took a look at the man that Laurie had been talking about all week. "Mike. Della, I want you to meet my friend Mike," Laurie told her. Della smiled at the young man. He was very good looking and seemed to be very polite. To top it off, he had sent her flowers and was giving her the choice of places that he could take her. It was a big step above most of the men she had seen in the past. The 4 of them left together out of the house and each of them got into their own cars. Perry smiled at Laurie and Mike as he opened the door for Della. Mike was holding the door open for Laurie and Perry was impressed. This young man was a gentleman and it was quite obvious that he liked Della's sister. Della and Perry were still working on their personal relationship. There was no doubt in either one of their minds that at this moment they cared very deeply for each other, and time would decide how the relationship would continue. Tonight they would go out together once more and dine and dance. He had reserved a seat next to the window overlooking the lights of the city. He looked over at his friend and wanted to hold her in his arms. But he would be doing that soon on the dance floor. Mike was thrilled that Laurie had accepted his invitation to dinner and a dance. He had never met a woman like her. She was all business at the office, but here in his car she looked as if she was out for fun. She looked good in her dress and heels and her hair had been put up. He was pleased with her appearance. Laurie looked at her date. He looked good at work, but oh, tonight he sure looked very good in his clothes. He was dressed for either a fancy restaurant or a club. When she had heard Perry say that he and Della were going to Kavanaugh's, Laurie had decided it would be best for her and Mike to go to the same nightclub that she had gone with Della. It was a great place, and as she was now known by the bouncer, they would get right in. That would impress Mike, of that she was sure. As Mike pulled up to the nightclub, the valet opened the door for him and Laurie. He could see that the line was long and he hoped that at some point they would get in. He was very hungry. But he forgot who his date was. She was a friend of the famous Perry Mason, and the bouncer at the door welcomed her in with no wait at all. "Boy, this is nice," he thought to himself as he tipped the valet and the doorman. It was going to cut him, but he knew that he was in for a treat. Of that he was sure. He had always been among the commoners and standing there watching The rich and famous walk in. This was a change that he could get used to. The nightclub was so crowded and the two of them were seated over at the other end of the room. It was so smoky that Mike was not sure that he would be able to enjoy a meal and a dance here in all of the smoke and noise. But he had the best of company with Lori and he wanted her to have a good time. Della and Perry had now been shown to their table. The two of them had been to there many times and Perry usually tried to get the same table. It was a very romantic spot overlooking the entire city. The restaurant was at the rooftop of one of the tallest buildings in the city and it rotated 24 hours a day. The restaurant rotated so slowly that you could not feel the movement as you sat down to eat or when you danced. It was a wonderful place and Della thought that someday she would like to live in such a home someday. She took her seat and looked at the menu. She knew what she wanted already but she glanced at the menu anyways. It was a lovely place and Perry had them served nothing but the best of wine. Both of them enjoyed their steak and potato dinner together. Their conversation was light and cheerful. After the dinner and Perry had his after-dinner smoke and Della had gone to the ladies' room and freshened up, they went out to the dance floor together. Perry was glad that it was time for the dancing. He had been working too hard the past week. It was time for he and Della to enjoy themselves. He had said that they should keep work and leisure separate and so far it had worked. They worked hard together but tonight was the night for fun. Perry and Della went out to the dance floor and danced a slow dance together. It was a nice dance and Della wished that it would not end. It was a nice place to dance and with the wine and the moving floor made it very sexy. Della held on to Perry tight as they walked back to the table and as she took her seat she wanted to sit on the other side of the table with him. She looked out over the city and watched the lights for a few minutes. She listened to the music and watched as the others danced and enjoyed her time with Perry. Meanwhile Lori and Mike were having the time of their life together. They had a good dinner together and Lori had sipped some wine. Then they had danced and danced until she thought that her feet would fall off. Lori now knew that he was the man that she had been waiting for and she did not want to do anything to discourage him. Mike was very impressed with his date. She was everything that he wanted in a woman. Smart, kind and could dance like a pro. She was wonderful and without thinking he gave her a big hug right out there on the dance floor. Mike was not used to being in such a place with such a nice girl and was trying his best to be a gentleman. As Lori felt Mike give her a hug her heart melted. What else could she want in a man? He was single, good looking, had a good job and he was a gentleman through and through. She hoped that this date was the first of many dates to come. The hug was so warm but too short. She had hoped that he would kiss her but he had not. Perry and Della stayed at the dance until nearly midnight and then Perry had asked her if she would like to go home. Della did want in some ways to go home but in other ways she wanted to stay with Perry at the dance. Yes. We can go to my home and have an after drink, she told him, hoping that he would say all right. Perry looked down at Della with a smile. That offer sounds too good to say no to. I will be glad to stop at your home and have a glass of wine. Della knew that Lori would be out until the nightclub closed at 2 and that she and Perry would have the house together for a while. When the two of them got to Della and Laura's home, Della had Perry take a seat in the living room. She went to the liquor cabinet and poured them both a drink. Della sat down next to Perry and they clicked their glasses together and toasted each other. To the only woman who is in my life. May we be as one. For as long as we both wish it. Perry told her. To you, may we be as one for as long as we both wish it, she told him with a smile. Perry had been waiting for the chance to kiss Della all night and put his glass down, and As she placed her glass on the coaster, he reached for her. She leaned closer to him and their lips met for a long passionate kiss. The two of them looked at each other with such caring that words could not express. Perry put his arms around Della and they sat back on the couch. Once more. They could stay there together all night if they were allowed to, but it was not the time for that. Perry stood up and put the music on and sat back down. It had not seemed that they had been together for too long when they heard the front door open. The lights had been on very low, but Laurie knew that Perry was there because his car was there, so she tried to be as loud as she could be. Della laughed a little and Perry smiled as they heard Laurie and Mike coming back home. They both knew that Laurie was trying to warn them that she and Mike were coming in. But Perry's arm did not move and he kept it around Della. He did not care. Laurie knew how he felt about her sister, and her friend Mike might as well know. Perry and Della did not care at that point anymore. Mike and Laurie came in and smiled and said their hellos to Perry and Della. Laurie went to the liquor cabinet and offered everyone a glass of wine. All of them joined in a drink and sat back to relax. Fortunately, the house had a couch and a love seat so that the four of them could sit together in comfort. The conversation was pleasant, but now it was time for the men to leave for their own homes. It was nearly 3 in the morning and now they were both genuinely tired. "I am afraid that I must go home," Perry told them. "I will call you in the morning, Della," he promised. At this point both Laurie and Mike knew that Perry and Della would like a minute alone, and so Laurie told them, "I just want to show Mike the house for a minute and then I guess that the night is over. I have had a great time." She reached over and gave Perry a squeeze of his hand. At no point was she interested in Perry for anything but a friend or future brother-in-law, but she cared for him just the same. Perry smiled at Laurie. Sometimes she reminded him of Della just a bit. She loved and cared for her sister very much. Once the two had left the room, Perry turned to Della and smiled. "Your sister is quite a nice young lady." Della smiled at Perry and looked up into his eyes. "I am lucky to have such wonderful people in my life. I like Mike, I think he will do Laurie good." She put her arms around his shoulders and he bent down to give her a good night kiss. It was long and passionate, the type of kiss that does not stop until one runs out of breath. But Della did not let go and Perry had no interest in her doing so. They just stood in the living room together for a few minutes and enjoyed the moment together. Perry opened the front door and left. Soon Mike left too and the home was once more quiet. The two sisters smiled and went to bed. Della thought to herself Perry had said that he would call her in the morning. She already missed him. Laurie had found Mike both charming and kind. He had treated her as a lady all night and she was hoping that this was the beginning of a lasting relationship. Mike headed home and thought about Laurie, the lady that he had spent the night with. She was everything that he could ask for and more. He hoped that the two of them would be able to go out together soon again. The next day, true to his word, Perry called Della at 11 in the morning. Della did not want him to know that she had not been able to go to sleep when he had left the night before, and at 11 in the morning she was just sipping her morning coffee. She had not felt bad about it, because Laurie was still in bed. "Good morning, Della. I was just calling to make sure that you are all right after a date that lasted until 3 am. I think I am getting too old for it. I just got up at 10:30. Perry told her with a laugh. "Well, that makes me feel better, Perry. I just got up myself. Laurie, my sleeping beauty, has not gotten up yet. I think that she and Mike had a good night together," Della told him with a smile in her voice. "He seemed to be a very nice young man. He is a big step from some of the men that she has dated." My favorite was the one with the long hair and the nose ring. He was an artist with no money and no manners. I almost died when he asked me if I would like to go for a ride on his motorcycle with him. Perry said with a laugh. Oh, but he had a good heart. He just was too wild. I will never forget when he brought me the 25-pound roll of cheese that he had won. I finally finished eating it. Della laughed. I remember it well. Every time I went to your house for months I brought home a chunk of the cheese. Maybe I could call him and see if he could get you some more, he told her with a laugh. Well, I just wanted to make sure that everything is all right at the street home, and I was thinking about you, Della. I will see you on Monday, Perry told her. I am looking forward to it. You can call me anytime. I do not mind, Della told him. Lori had heard Della on the phone and had come into the kitchen. What's up, she asked her sister. Nothing, he just called to say hello, Della said as she walked back to the coffee pot for another cup of coffee. I wish Mike would call, but I will see him Monday, Lori told her. Wait until you have seen him 5 days a week for over 5 years, she told her sister. Honestly, Mike woke up at almost noon the next day. He had been out all night almost, and he was sure that Steve was wondering what had happened. Mike walked out onto the patio and found Steve talking to one of the neighbors about a problem that he was having with his computer. Steve was explaining how certain programs worked, but Mike could tell that the neighbor had no idea what Steve was talking about. Mike came out through the sliding door and Mike introduced him to a Mr. Botters, Jim Botters, the man who lived next door to them. And introduced him to several more neighbors. The neighborhood was a nice middle-class neighborhood with lots of children. That Monday things seemed to be the same as they had always been for Lori and Steve. Just that they had a new co-worker who was their friend. But they heard an argument in Ryan's office. He was yelling on the phone and sounded very upset. He came into the office and told Mike to come in, he wanted to talk to him. As the weeks passed, Lori and Mike had become an everyday item. Mike barely ever came home, but to change his clothes and sleep. Steve knew that it was not going to be long before Mike popped the question. It had been 6 weeks since Mike had come to work at her office, and Lori could not have been happier. Each day their lives had become more and more entwined, and Lori looked forward to seeing him every day. That Tuesday Lori had been working late on one of her programs when Ryan asked her to come into his office. Lori went in and took a seat. Ryan looked at Lori seriously and then told her, I have noticed that you and Mike have become very close over the past few weeks. But, before you go any farther, I want to tell you something. He cleared his throat and studied Lori's face. I have been watching you from my office since I started this business and you came to work for me. I did not know how to tell you, but I want to tell you how I feel. Lori, I would like to ask you to be my wife. Lori did not know what to say. She had never thought of Ryan as anything but her boss. She had no feelings for him at all. I am sorry, Ryan, I like you. You are a good friend to me, but that is all that I feel right now. She looked over at him and saw the hurt on his face. Lori got up from the seat and walked out the door. She did not know what to do. It was the worst time of her life so far. With that, she left the office and headed home. Ryan sat at his desk and thought about what had just happened. Lori could still work for him, of course, but he wondered what work would be like from now on. Then he had that man from the Crater Computer Company that kept calling, offering him a large sum of money for his company. Maybe he would sell. All he had to his life was this business, he was not going to ever let go of it. Lori drove home slowly that night. She did know what to do. This was something that she was going to have to think this over. There was no way that she could keep her job at the same company that Ryan owned, but she liked the work. It just was not fair. Life had been so good, and now Lori called the house and got no answer. She knew that her sister was either at work or with Perry. She decided to talk to Mike. She called Mike and told him what had happened. He was very understanding about it and told her that he would come over and talk to her. Lori was pacing back and forth in the living room when Mike came to her home that night. She let Mike in and gave him a hug. She wanted things to be the same as they had been just a few short hours ago. Lori offered Mike a cup of coffee and they both took a seat at the kitchen table. He cleared his throat and said, "This is a situation that can be handled many ways. You can choose to continue working as if nothing had ever happened, or I could confront Ryan and tell him that what he did was sexual harassment, or you and I can quit our jobs." "Oh no, I cannot quit my job. Because I am one of the original 6 people who came to work. In the office I own 19% of the company. Ryan owns 24% because he was the founding force behind the company. If I quit before the end of next year, I give up those shares. That could mean over $1,000 of a loss to me. I have worked too long and hard to lose that." Lori told Mike. "Do you think that you can continue working there without problems?" Mike asked her. "I can. It just could be a little difficult if Ryan does feel the way that he feels. What worries me is that this company, Crater Computers, has been trying to buy the company. I oppose this. And the 5 of us are divided on this issue. I am the one that has sort of sees odd on the subject. Without my vote, I am concerned that our small business could be bought out and brought to another country," she told him. "I could talk to him if you wish," Mike offered. "Oh hon, that is so kind of you to offer that. But I will have to deal with this, but I could use your support. I really appreciate your offer," Lori told her. It was then that they heard Della's car, and behind it was Perry's. "Perhaps it would be a good idea if you talk to Perry," Mike told her. Perry and Della came into the house and smiled at the two who were sitting there at the table, having the very serious discussion. They looked at the two and Della asked them, "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Can we go into the living room, please? There is something that I need to talk to you about." "Sorry that I have to bring business to your pleasure," Lori told Perry. She looked at Lori with a face that let him know that what she had to say was serious. The 4 of them took a seat in the living room and listened Lori's story. Perry thought for a moment and told her, "You should at least let me contact him about the sexual harassment. It would protect you. I would not give up my job if I were you. The papers that you signed when your company incorporated forbid you from quitting only in the case of your death or total disability from quitting, or you lose your ownership. Did you ever think that perhaps Ryan told you this so that you would quit? You said that there is a company that wants to buy your company and that your vote has stopped the sale," Perry told her. "I will think on it. Tomorrow is Saturday, so I will have the weekend to think it over. I will let you know." "I thank you so much," Lori told him. Perry looked at Della and Mike, who both looked very worried. "I will have Paul Drake look into this company who is trying to purchase your company. Is that all right with you?" Perry asked. "It is all right, and thanks again, Perry. I do not know what I would do without you," Lori told him. She could not help herself, but she gave him a hug. She so wished that her sister and this wonderful man would get married. To her surprise, Perry hugged her back and promised her that everything would work out all right. Well, I am starved. Anyone in the mood for food? Mike asked. I am sorry, Della, and I just got back from dinner. But you and Lori go ahead and have your dinner. Go out and enjoy yourself and do not worry, Lori. Perry told her as he stepped away from her hug. Okay, thanks again, and with that Lori went to room and got freshened up. Mike thanked Perry for helping Lori and promised him that he would keep an eye on her. Once Lori and Mike left, Della looked at Perry and told him, I do not like what Lori told us. I think that perhaps there is a problem with the purchase of the company. Ryan has never mentioned his feelings before. It would not be the first time that a man had not let his feelings be known to a co-worker. Della told him. After the words had come out, she realized that she could have been talking about their relationship. It had not been the meaning, but it could have been read that way. Perry studied Della for a moment and knew that she was worried, and what she had said was true. If Ryan was like him, he could have held his feelings for a long time. Perhaps the relationship that Lori now had with Mike had made Ryan take his move. That was where he had to have Paul look into that. He looked at Della and with a serious look said, Della, I am worried too. I think that I will call Paul in the morning and have him look into it, and with that he sat on the couch and patted the cushion next to him. Let's watch the presidential debate. Della smiled and turned on the television. She thought that it was funny that they would be watching the debate that night. Perry was a Republican through and through, but he did not support this candidate. It would be an interesting night, and she could sit back and lie in his arms once more. She lay back and he put his arm around her. It was off to the political circus. She listened intently to the debate and was not convinced to change her mind. Both parties were a disgrace as far as she was concerned. She could not help but worry about Lori. The one constant thing in her sister's life was her job, and now that was in jeopardy. Della was going to have to depend on Perry and Paul once more to help her out. The debate being over, Perry reached over and took the remote. He shut off the television and looked at Della. Della, I want to help Lori. She is like my family. You are my family. And she is your sister. Don't worry, she will be all right. Perry took both her hands and squeezed them. Perry, how can I ever pay you? Della cried and put her head on his shoulders. The two of them sat there and held each other once more. Mike and Lori had stopped at the market and picked up a few items to make for their supper. Steve was going to be gone for the weekend, so the house was empty and Mike and Lori could spend the time together alone. Mike felt in his pocket. In his pocket was the ring that he had planned to give to Lori on her birthday next Saturday. He wanted to marry the lady. He knew that the two of them were made for each other. He was going to be 30 in a couple of years. And he thought that the time had come for the big question. Mike and Lori made the dinner together and enjoyed the time together. Because they both had roommates, the time that they had together alone was little. They ate a hearty meal and went to the living room for some quiet moments. Neither one of them had gone further than kissing and hugging, and that was the way that Lori wanted it. She was saving herself for marriage, and that was the way things were. Mike would honor her wishes. The night went well at both of the homes, and Perry went home around 11 that night. He and Della were going to go on a ride south in the morning. After he talked to Paul, they were going to leave for San Diego. The weather was supposed to be warm and beautiful, and he wanted to spend time alone with his girl. Mike had just said good night to Lori when the phone rang. It was Ryan, and he wanted to talk to Mike about Lori. Please come over to my office. I just want to talk to you about something very important, he asked. Mike agreed to come to his office and said that he would be there in about 40 minutes. When he went out to his car, he was surprised to not see Steve's car. Even though Steve had said that he was going to be gone that weekend, he was sure that he had heard a car in the driveway. He put it off as probably a neighbor and started to go to the office, but the car was making a strange noise and he had to pull over. His rear tire was almost entirely flat, so had to stop and change it. He knew that he was going to be late, so he called Ryan to let him know. After he changed the tire, Mike got into his car and headed over to the office. The streets were bare, but when he got to the office he saw Ryan's car in the parking lot. Mike took the elevator up to the 6th floor, nodding to the security guard that was sitting in the lobby. When he hit the floor 6 button, all was quiet. When he entered the office though, the lights were off. He called out to Ryan but got no answer. So he went over to Ryan's office and opened the door. But the door seemed to be blocked and he called out again. When he got no answer, he pushed the door hard and saw a hand. He shoved the door once more and saw that Ryan was lying on the floor unconscious. He thought that he needed to get into the room and help Ryan, so he pushed the door again. Once Mike was able to squeeze himself through the door, he saw that there was nothing that he could do, for Ryan had been shot. He looked around the room and saw the gun on the floor. Without thinking, he picked it up. It was then that he heard a noise and the security guard came walking in. There he was in the office and holding the gun that had killed Ryan Bowers. The guard looked at him and cried out, "Please don't kill me, Mr. Platt. I won't tell anyone about this. Don't be stupid. I didn't kill this man. When I got here he was dead. Call the police and tell them that they are needed here." Mike stood there and paced back and forth as he waited for the police to arrive. He had not seen anyone when he arrived or heard anything. "Where is the murderer?" Lt. Tragg from Homicide was the first officer on the scene. He looked over at the body and could see that the man had not been dead very long, and the gun that was found at the scene was most likely the gun that killed him. "I am afraid that I need to take you downtown, Mr. Platt, for questioning. I hope you have a good lawyer," Lt. Tragg told him. Perry Mason. He needed to call Della and have her call Perry. He was in trouble, deep trouble, and word is Perry Mason was the best. He called Laura's home and Della answered. "Sorry Mike, Lori is still out. I have not seen her yet. Della, I am in trouble. Someone has murdered Ryan Bowers and I have been seen holding the murder weapon. They are taking me downtown for questioning." Mike told her. "Do not worry, I will call Perry right away and he will meet you at the police station," Della promised him. Della called Perry right away. He was just getting ready for bed when his phone rang and saw that it was Della. "Hi Della. What brings you to call me at this time of night?" he asked her with a smile. Della told Perry what had happened and he promised her that he would let her and Lori know what was going on as soon as he found out anything. "Do not worry, Han, tell Lori that I will take care of Mike," and with that he hung up. Just as Della hung up the phone, Lori came in the house. She could see by the look on her sister's face that she was upset. "What's wrong, Della?" she asked. "Lori, have a seat, I have something to tell you," she told her. Della sat next to her sister and told her what had happened. Lori could not believe it. She began to cry. "Lori, Perry will call us as soon as he knows something," he promised. She held her little sister in her arms, more worried than she wanted Lori to know. "I will wait with you for Perry to call, okay? I will make some coffee, because I think this will be one of those long nights that I have learned to get used to," she promised her sister. Perry got into his clothes and headed once more to the place that he went at least once every 2 weeks to. He was getting into his car when he recalled what he had said to Della. On the phone without thinking. He had called her Han, it had just slipped, but he headed down to the police station to make sure that his friend Mike Platt was taken care of legally. When he got to the station, he went down the familiar hallway and was led into the room where Mike Platt was being held. Mike looked up when the door was opened and breathed a breath of relief when he saw Perry walk into the room. Lt. Trag had been waiting for the attorney to come and he followed the attorney in. Perry, this man was found in the victim's room with the gun in his hand. He was found by the security guard holding the gun over the dead body of Ryan Bowers. Please allow me a few moments with my client, Perry asked him. Perry took a seat across from his friend and asked for what happened. Mike told Perry everything that he remembered and how he had to push the body out of the way, because it was blocking the door. He had found the gun in the room and was looking around the room when the security guard had entered the room. It was a long night and Mike and Perry did not leave until after 3. Perry knew that Lori and Della would be waiting for his call, so he stopped by their house. As he suspected, the lights were on and he knew that both women would be happy to see Mike and him. Della had been sitting in the living room watching an old movie with Lori sleeping very lightly on the couch when she heard Perry's car pull up. She went to the front door and to her joy she saw both Perry and Mike walking up her walk. She embraced Mike, who walked over to Lori and kissed her gently awake. Perry smiled down at Della and put his arm around her. It is going to be okay, Della. They just wanted to question him. I have already called Paul and he is on the case right now. We will find out who the murderer is, I promise all of you. The best thing that we can do is go over anything that has happened at the office, anything that was out of the ordinary. If Ryan seemed upset or was getting strange calls, anything that you can think of, let me know. We will find out who the murderer is, but it will be much easier with your help, he told the group. Lori went up to Perry and just gave him another hug. I cannot stop hugging you. If it was not for you, Mike would be in jail. How do we thank you? She asked. Lori, we need to find out who did this. The police will find out about what happened between you and Ryan, and I am afraid that it will not look good for him. Also, Ryan has been at the job for over 30 days and with Ryan's death he picks up 5 shares of your company. Those shares are worth about $100,000, so he has 2 reasons to want him dead. We need to find out what is going on fast, Perry told her with a sad tone in his voice. What worried Della all night had been just what Perry had said. She too knew that Lt. Trag would soon have that information, and if they did not have anything to counter it, Mike could be facing murder charges. She looked over at Mike and Lori and could have just cried. They were such a nice young couple, with their whole life ahead of them. This was something that Perry and Paul were going to have to find the murderer. Mike could not go to jail. Perry and Mike looked at each other and then at Della and Lori. Well, I told you that I would let you know what happened as soon as I knew, and now we all need to get some sleep. I will come over here tomorrow afternoon around 1 and we will work on this together. By that time Paul should have some information for me, he told them. He reached over and took Della by the arms and whispered, we will find out who is the murderer. We have never failed before and I will not make this my first time. Go to sleep. Everything will work out. He kissed the top of her head and then watched as Mike kissed Lori goodbye. And with that the 2 men left for Mike's office parking lot. His car was still there and then they both headed home. Della felt helpless as she looked at her sister, so she put her arm around her shoulder and told her not to worry. Perry will be here at 1 and he will have more answers. To say that there was much sleep at the street house that night would have been an Irration. Della tossed and turned as she knew Lori was doing. It was almost 5 in the morning when she finally fell asleep. The next morning Della got out something for her to make for lunch. Perry and Mike would be over at 1 and she wanted to make something for them to eat. Some of the best decisions and discoveries had been made over a good meal. Then she thought of Paul too, who would probably be coming over also, and took out another steak. When Lori came into the kitchen she looked as if she had not slept at all. You could tell that she had been crying too. Della gave her a cup of coffee and the two sisters sat down to a very sad breakfast. Lori just looked at Della and nearly broke down in tears again. Della kept busy with the dishes and household chores, waiting for Perry and Mike to show up. Lori did her best and had started the grill for the steaks. She had peeled the potatoes and made the salad before their friends showed up. Soon it was near 1 and the two of them sat down for a short break before the real work began.